Well, here we go again. Another day, another NDP Liberal financial scandal, this time a contracting fried supply chain. What is the total value of misappropriated funds under the Indigenous procurement system?
I do not have that information, and you would have to actually refer to Indigenous Services Canada. We are working on the 5% related to PSPC's targets.
The Assembly of First Nations testified that there are a number of shell companies securing government contracts in the Indigenous procurement program. How many shell companies has the government detected and identified?
Again, I think you would have to direct that question to Indigenous Services Canada, who are responsible for the IBD.
To your knowledge, is ISC actually looking into the number of shell companies?
I am not familiar with their activities, sorry.
To your knowledge, has ISC or anyone at PSPC made any referrals to the RCMP?
I am not aware.
How many cases has PSPC identified in which a company hires an Indigenous person simply to gain access to federal contracts through the Indigenous procurement program?
Again, that is a program that is held by the Indigenous Services Canada, and they would be the ones identifying, not PSPC.
Chair, I'm ceding the rest of my time to Mr. Genuis.
Thank you, Chair. The AFN has said, as my colleague mentioned, that most of the companies receiving Indigenous set-asides are actually shell companies. That's according to the AFN. Do you agree with their findings?
I would not be able to provide that information, or will I?
But you're sorry to jump in. You're the procurement department, though. You're responsible for overseeing government procurement. This is a very serious allegation from one of the leading Indigenous organizations in the country. Do you have an opinion on it at all?
I do not have an opinion, and I would refer you to request that question to the Indigenous Services Canada.
Okay, that's very striking. Most of the companies are shell companies, according to this program, and you're responsible for procurement, and you don't have an opinion either way. The government uses its own deeply flawed Indigenous business list rather than relying on criteria and lists developed by Indigenous organizations. Why is that?
That is the rules that we are bound by, and those rules are set by Indigenous Services Canada as well as the Treasury Board Secretariat of Canada.
But why is it that that you develop your own list instead of working with Indigenous organizations and relying on lists that they develop? Is there a policy rationale that you're aware of?
I am not aware of that. That is a responsibility of the Indigenous Services Canada. And we are bound by those rules, and we are working on how we can actually increase Indigenous.
So can I just clarify then? They make all the rules, and you make none of the rules with respect to how you define what is an Indigenous company or what is or is not a shell company. Do you don't have any role whatsoever? You're saying?
No, we do not. That is the Indigenous Services Canada's responsibility to develop those definitions.
How come you're responsible for procurement for everything except Indigenous procurement then?
We are responsible for procuring and trying to increase the Indigenous participation in procurement, but the rules related to the IBD are not ours, and the rules to the PSIB is not ours.
Fraud prevention in a general sense, is fraud prevention part of your role?
Not in the Indigenous Services Canada IBD. They are the ones that are doing the audits and the validation of those companies.
It's bizarre to me then that you are the procurement department. Presumably you're supposed to have some expertise on this area, and yet you're taking none of the responsibility in the particular case of Indigenous procurement. I want to ask as well, the way to prevent shell companies from giving all of the work to non-Indigenous companies is to have subcontracting requirements. And that's why the rules require that a certain proportion of subcontracts under the Indigenous set-aside go to Indigenous companies. Are these subcontracting rules enforced?
So there are various ways for us to actually increase Indigenous participation in our contracts. One of them is for the prime
Sorry,
contractor.
very limited time. Can you answer the specific question? The 1/3 subcontract rule, is it enforced?
But in what context do you want that? Like if there is an
When
Indigenous
an Indigenous
requirement.
company ma'am, it's very simple. When an Indigenous company receives a contract under a set aside, they are required to have 1/3 of their subcontracts be Indigenous companies. It appears that there is no tracking of this. Very simple question. Is this 1/3 subcontract rule enforced? Yes or no?
That would be enforced by Indigenous Services Canada.
Is it being enforced right now? Or you don't know?
They would be the ones that would be able to answer that question.
Ma'am, it either is being enforced, it isn't being enforced, or you don't know if it's being enforced. That's my question. Which is
You would
do
have
not
to
know?
refer to Indigenous Services Canada to obtain a response to that question.
Mr. Chair, I believe that's my time, but can you put the question to the witness and insist that she provides a response? If she doesn't know, she doesn't know, but she should tell us she doesn't know. Is the requirement being enforced? I think I've asked the question 4 or 5 times now, and the witness has an obligation to answer it.
Ms. Paquette?
It would be the responsibility of Indigenous Services Canada to actually enforce that, and they're doing the audits and validation of this happening. And that's what I know. I don't know whether or not they are doing it, but I would say that that's their responsibility, and therefore they're doing it.
Maybe I can ask.
Okay, so she doesn't know if it's being enforced.
Yeah. Does PSPC, maybe I can just ask for Mr. Genuis, does PSPC not have an oversight responsibility for that, considering it's purchasing?
Not in
And I'm
the
just trying to
Indigenous,
continue maybe-
not in the Indigenous services, for the IBD list, we're not the ones responsible for validating or auditing that list
The list or for purchases?
for the directory. So we're
Yes, sir. So
responsible for procuring. We're not responsible for the directory, but we need to actually validate the
I
through the
apologize.
directory.
I just want to make sure we were getting the right question to you. I think we'll move on to Ms. Atwin now.
Yeah, sorry, Chair. Just a point of order, though.
Sorry,
we're
Ms.
still not
Atwin,
getting
just 1 second. Did that not answer the question as put forward, Mr. Genuis?
I understand that they don't maintain the list, but it's a question of whether a rule around subcontracting is enforced. That is a responsibility that should follow the procurement department, and the witness is saying she doesn't know, which is.
So I guess the question
bizarre.
is the the rules being enforced around subcontracting, not the list, but the actual contracting rules being followed for subcontracting?
So Indigenous Services Canada are responsible for the PSIB. They are responsible for the definition. So the companies that they have in their directory would actually follow that. The subcontractor or the 33% is still under their purview to investigate.
They are following the rules or not is Indigenous Services and PSPC would not be aware.
Correct.